So this screencast is looking at the distinction between long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply in the classical view of economics. So there's a segment of economists that are called classical economists, sometimes called monetarists, but we're going to use the term classical economics. Classical economists who believe that that in the short run, an economy might be in some kind of a disequilibrium. We'll explain what we mean by that in a second. But in the long run, an economy will always be producing at its level of potential output. In other words, here's a production possibilities curve here. That a classical economist believes that in the long run, given enough time, market forces will make adjustments in labor and resource markets so that we're always going to end up on the production possibilities curve, right? So always on the production possibilities curve. A classical economist believes that if we're outside the PPC or inside the PPC, if we're overproducing or underproducing, if we're beyond full employment of all resources or below full employment of all resources, market forces will get us back to being at full employment. So what are we saying? We're saying that a classical economist believes that the potential output or the potential GDP, right here, potential GDP in an economy is based upon, let me fix that screen just a little bit. The potential GDP in an economy is really fixed. It's based upon the quality and amount of resources, land, labor, capital, technology, entrepreneurship. The only way that you actually get long-term growth in an economy is by improving the quality or quantity of resources. Prices aren't going to matter here. That regardless of prices, economies are always going to be at full employment. Or look at it this way: regardless of prices, potential output is fixed. We can't move beyond it. We can't move beyond this simply by changes in price. We have to the only way we can improve the potential output of the economy is if we do things to move the long-run aggregate supply curve. So what does that mean? What's the distinction then between, say, short run and long run? Well, in the short run, we might find at any moment that potential output's here, but that the economy is producing here at what we're calling GDP at this point. The GDP is here at this point. In other words, the economy in the short run is producing more output than what the factors of production would necessarily allow us to have. These are factories running overtime, workers running overtime, things being kind of superheated. In other words, we are overemployed. We're beyond full employment of all factors of production right here at this point here. We see the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve are determining that that's where we are. Well, the classical economist says this is going to self-correct. There's a disequilibrium here, but it's going to self-correct. And this is the way it's going to self-correct. If we're overusing factors of production, in other words, there is more quantity demanded of a factor of production than quantity supplied. In other words, there are more hours to work than workers available to work them. Anytime you have a shortage of a product, of any kind of product in the resource market, in this case we're talking about labor, anytime you have a shortage, that's going to drive prices up. So picture here, at this point here, what we might have is we might have a lot of workers, say, working overtime. Or there might be a lot of interest in hiring people, but no ability to actually find those workers. There's nobody unemployed. So if there's nobody unemployed, but there's still an interest in hiring lots more workers, when demand for labor goes up, but there's nobody unemployed, the only thing that can happen is the price of labor goes up. If the price of labor goes up, that's one of the costs or one of the determinants of short-run aggregate supply. If the cost of labor goes up, then we're going to see that short-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left, because if that resource costs more, the economy is only going to supply that same level of output at a higher average price level to recoup the costs. It's sort of like in the micro models, right? You're only going to sell more if you can get a higher price, or you're only going to sell it if you can get a higher price because your cost went up. So we see that what happens is that the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and we end up in a new equilibrium, GDP1. GDP1 is still beyond full employment. In other words, we're still operating at a level beyond potential output. Remember, potential output is fixed by the amount and quality of factors of production. If we're beyond there, we still have pressure on prices in the resource markets to go up. The rent on stores is going to go up. The wages for workers are going to go up. In other words, we still have this leftward pressure on the short run aggregate supply curve. In other words, I've said in other words a lot now, haven't I? In other words, market forces are going to bring us back to the long run aggregate supply curve. We're either at full employment or we're on our way back to full employment. The classical economist believes there is nothing to be done other than to wait for market forces to correct this disequilibrium. In this case, this disequilibrium, we call it an inflationary gap because it has the tendency to produce higher prices or create higher prices. Therefore, we call it inflationary. So if the economy in the short run is at a point of output beyond long-run aggregate supply, then what happens is that we have pressure on prices to go up. We're going to get inflation. We're going to get the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift back to a point where we are now at an equilibrium with long-run aggregate supply. This is self-correcting. Government has to not do anything here. There is no role for government to play in correcting anything here. This is because prices are flexible and changing. Short-run aggregate supply, if it's momentarily creating an equilibrium that is out of whack with long run, then things are going to correct themselves. So this is a self-correcting view of the economy that classical economists have. This particular example is called an inflationary gap.